It's 72 BC. We're at Ariminum on the northeast coast of the Italian peninsula. The legate Mummius senses an opportunity for a swift victory. Maneuvering his legions behind the rebel force commanded by Spartacus, Mummius is under strict orders. He must not attack. And yet, Spartacus seems to be there for the taking. Easy business. For Mummius, the temptation is just too great. He leaps into action, driving his legions forward into the rebels. It's a disaster. Many of the escaped slaves fighting under Spartacus are highly trained. Some are even former gladiators, quite skilled in hand-to-hand combat. And what's more, they're fighting for their freedom. They overpower Mummius and his two legions with some ease. It quickly becomes a full-on rout as terrified legionnaires flee the battlefield. Mummius has woefully underestimated Spartacus's men. It's an embarrassing defeat. And the overall Roman commander, Marcus Licinius Crassus, does not like embarrassing defeats. Mummius and his men, therefore, must be punished for their failure. To execute this punishment, Crassus calls on a method from the early days of the Roman Republic, the method known today as decimation. Mummius's soldiers are hauled before the rest of the army. A military tribune presents their lists of crimes: cowardice, ill discipline, poor soldiering, all things that are unacceptable for Roman soldiers. Now Crassus himself steps forward. He reprimands Mummius and his men and reminds them of what is at stake. Spartacus's slave rebellion threatens the integrity of the Roman Republic. It even threatens its very existence. Rome depends on legions to keep them safe, and if the legions fall, then Rome falls with it. From each offending cohort of troops, the name of every soldier is placed into an upturned helmet, and the ceremony begins. 8 names are drawn for each century of roughly 80 men. All of the faltering soldiers are being punished, but that punishment is shared collectively across the ranks. For the crimes of the unit, 10% of its men will die. As the tribune passes each cohort, the legionnaires squeeze their eyes tightly shut, their lips twitch in silent prayer, offering supplications to whichever god might save them. They plead with the hand of fate to pass them over and to give them another chance. Nonetheless, names are read out, and the unfortunate men are led to the front of the cohort. Those who remain behind are relieved. They're sorry to see their comrades go, but they're also happy that it's not them this time. The named men kneel, then the swoop of an axe brings their lives to an end. As the heads roll into the dust, the others watch on. The lesson has been learned. Cowardice, impatience, or an unwillingness to follow orders will not be tolerated. When one legionnaire falters, all are put at risk. Mummius is humiliated. His forces are reduced by 10%, but he will escape with his life, as will the remaining men. But they won't escape punishment altogether. Writing of another decimation, the historian Plutarch tells of surviving soldiers who were placed on barley rations rather than the standard wheat given to the legions. They were also forced to bivouac outside the main camp. In other words, they were made examples of. This way, other troops understood what was expected of them, and they also understood what would come to them if they didn't meet these expectations. What we're dealing with here is one of the most famous Roman punishments: decimation. The first mention of decimation comes from Livy, who describes how the punishment was used by Appius Claudius Crassus Sabinus in 471 BC. After his troops rebelled against him in a campaign against the Aquii and the Volsci tribes, the consul had every 10th rebel executed. At least, that's how Livy tells it. The 471 BC decimation may never have actually happened. In fact, There is evidence to suggest that the punishment was never really used at all, at least in the early centuries of the Roman Republic. Polybius describes the decimation in quite a lot of detail, and his account seems to align with the later accounts from Plutarch and other historians like Frontinus. So it seems at least that the concept of decimation was real, but there are few reliable descriptions of it actually being used. And this is quite unusual for Roman punishments. You see, the sources for punishments of this period are actually fairly good. The fact that decimation only gets a few descriptive mentions suggests that it was more of a threat rather than something that was happening regularly. By the 1st century BC, however, that seems to have changed. Decimation leaps beyond the realms of rhetoric and metaphor and becomes something very real. Roman generals of the 1st century BC were keen to instill some good old-fashioned discipline into their troops, even if that discipline was based on spurious historical record. Crassus was one such general, a big fan of the traditional values of the early Republic. Crassus unleashed decimation on Mummius and his legions during the Third Servile War. In some ways, this isn't all that surprising. For all the "I'm Spartacus" banter that has emerged in recent years, the Third Servile War of 73 to 71 BC was a serious issue and a genuine threat to Rome. Spartacus's slave revolt could have been the end of the Republic. At the Battle of Mount Vesuvius in 73 BC, Spartacus's 70 gladiators utilized guerrilla tactics to outsmart and defeat 3,000 Roman militia, and may have killed their commander, Gaius Claudius Glaber. Crassus, therefore, needed his legions to stand firm, and so there was no room for mercy. Decimation may have been odd and antiquated, but it certainly got the message across. Some accounts say that he killed 4,000 men in this manner, but this is almost certainly an exaggeration. It doesn't make sense for Crassus to cripple the fighting capability of his legions like this, especially not in the middle of an existential crisis like Spartacus's uprising. Instead, historians believe around 50 men were put to death in this way, which meant Crassus could still have wielded the remaining soldiers in battle. This seems to be a theme of decimations. Kill enough people to send a message, but don't destroy the unit as a fighting force. When Julius Caesar punished a mutiny in 49 BC, for example, he used decimation, but this probably involved killing just 12 people. Mark Antony may have also deployed this method 5 years later, but Cicero's account of this suggests he executed specifically chosen individuals rather than random soldiers. And if this is true, it doesn't really count as a decimation, regardless of the number of victims. According to Plutarch, though, Mark Antony did indeed use the technique in 39 BC after a defeat on his Parthian campaign. By the historian's account, quote, Antony visited those who had played the coward with what is called decimation. That is, he divided the whole number of them into tens and put to death that one from each 10 upon who the lot fell. For the rest, he ordered rations of barley instead of wheat. But were these punishments actually effective? Well, Crassus did eventually put down Spartacus's rebellion, so could he have done it without decimating Mummius's legions? We think he probably could have. And Mark Antony was ultimately successful in his Parthian campaign, but how pivotal was his violent show of strength against a defeated legion? Probably not that pivotal. In reality, this kind of violent retribution on a military unit that faltered in battle probably wasn't very effective. Roman armies won campaigns because of their tactics, training, and equipment, not because of ostentatious punishments. In fact, decimation could sometimes make matters worse. It could lead to mutiny from soldiers who were appalled with the idea of putting their fellow warriors to death. The historian G.R. Watson says, the army might be prepared to assist in the execution of innocent slaves, but professional soldiers could hardly be expected to cooperate in the indiscriminate execution of their own comrades. This is probably why actual documented instances of decimation are so few and far between. Octavian may have carried out a decimation in 34 BC, and Lucius Apronius may have done the same in 19 AD, but in total, there are only around 12 confirmed instances of this punishment. Years later, Emperor Macrinus tried to adopt a slightly gentler version of decimation. This was centesimatio, or the execution of every 100th man instead of every 10th, but this didn't really catch on. So, as an actual Roman punishment, decimation was pretty rare and likely not very effective. As a rhetorical tool, however, it may have been very effective indeed. The threat of decimation alone might have been enough to keep Roman legions in line. It might have also helped instill a sense of mutual reliance and comradeship within legions. Each legionnaire understood that they could be punished for the cowardice of their fellow soldier and vice versa. It's this rhetorical power that has kept the idea of decimation alive through the ages. At the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, more than 12,000 years after the Visigoths sacked Rome, decimation suddenly had an unexpected revival. This battle was notorious for its heavy casualties, as the Holy Roman and Swedish empires fought one of the pivotal clashes of the 30 Years' War. It became a Pyrrhic victory for the Swedish after King Gustavus Adolphus lost his life. For one regiment of Gottfried Heinrich Graf zu Pappenheim's corps, the heat of battle was too much. The regiment broke and fled and was subsequently found guilty of cowardice. After a series of executions, the remaining soldiers were decimated. 10% of the troops were hanged, while the remaining 90% were subject to ritual humiliations and beatings. The idea here was not simply to punish a fighting force, but to remove the force from the army altogether. There were similar scenes after the Swedish and Holy Roman Empires clashed once again at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1642, when Colonel Madlow's cavalry was said to have fled before a blow had even been struck. Madlow's troops were court-martialed and humiliated. 6 regiments that had performed admirably in the battle were given the honour of surrounding Madlow's sorry men. As insults were hurled upon them, their regimental colours were torn apart. Next, a series of dice rolls were used to select 90 men from the regiment. The officers among the condemned men were beheaded. The rest were hanged, their bodies displayed on the road between Rokycany and Lidolevi, serving as macabre warnings to anyone doubting the rigid discipline of the Holy Roman Empire. More recently, decimation was used in the First World War, as commanders desperately tried to maintain discipline amid the horror of industrial conflict. Luigi Cardona, the Italian commander-in-chief, was known as a tough disciplinarian, so it's no surprise he was a staunch advocate of decimation. The tactic was used at least 5 times by Italian forces during the war, including an incident in which 12 men were chosen at random from a fleeing unit and then shot in May 1916. As the war became increasingly dire for the Italians, Cardona tried to use decimation to bring rebellions under control. On July 16, 1917, 28 men of the 142nd Regiment were selected by the drawing of lots and then executed after a mutiny. After the crushing defeat at the Battle of Caporetto and the subsequent chaotic retreat in the face of the Austro-Hungarian advance, Cardona was sacked from his post. Cardona's legacy is complex. For some, he's a symbol of military incompetence and almost lost Italy the war. For others, he was a misunderstood tactician, struggling to adapt to the rigours of Alpine warfare. These dissenting voices tend to agree to one thing, however, that he was extremely cruel to his men. And this cruelty was often ineffective. For years, the Austro-Hungarians fought the Italians to a bloody stalemate on the Isonzo River before the Italian line finally broke at Caporetto. Armando Diaz, who succeeded Cardona as chief of staff, rejected his predecessor's cruel discipline. It was Diaz who oversaw the Italian victory in 1918 without decimating his troops in the process. But the Italians weren't the only proponents of decimation. The Russians didn't outlaw the practice until 1920, and there are reports of decimation used during the Battle of Teruel in the Spanish Civil War in 1938. Today, of course, the word decimation has taken on a whole different meaning. We take it to mean something like annihilation, the complete and utter destruction of a military unit or another entity. In fact, decimation was nothing like this. It was utilised as a symbolic punishment and was intended to instill a collective identity onto the unit in question, showing that comrades won and lost together and took responsibility for one another. It might seem rather unfair to execute 10% of a unit at random, rather than punishing individual acts of cowardice, but this randomness was part of its power. Roman armies weren't interested in individual valour or ingenuity. Their power was their unity and uniformity, and so this was how punishments were applied too. The punishment was also an incentive to keep on fighting, even when things looked hopeless. As the historian Louis Rawlings has pointed out regarding the Battle of Cannae, defeated armies of the period would typically experience a casualty rate of around 10%. Precisely the casualty rate you'd experience during a decimation. In circumstances like those, you might as well fight on. At least that way, your survival is in your own hands, rather than in the hands of fate. But as we've seen, threatening decimation was often more effective than actually carrying it out. There's very little point in killing 10% of your own troops at random, even if they have let you down in battle. This is probably why the practice was only used a dozen or so times, even over centuries of Roman military history. In more recent years, however, some commanders have used decimation in a slightly different flavour. They've used it as punishment for enemy troops, rather than their own. And that brings us to our final tale, which comes from the Finnish Civil War in 1918. When the Finnish White Army surrounded a poorly armed contingent of the socialist Finnish Red Army in February 1918, there was only likely to be one winner. Still, the Reds held out for 2 days, despite not even having enough guns to go around. When they finally ran out of ammo, some 700 Reds emerged from the mill building they'd been holed up in with their hands in the air. What followed has become known as the Lottery of Huruslahti. Men were plucked at random from the surrendered column and then lined up on the ice of the frozen lake Huruslahti. By this point, the Reds could expect no mercy. The shoot-on-the-spot declaration had already been made by the White leader, Karl Mannerheim. Anyone who had taken up arms against the Whites must be shot. The Reds wouldn't even have had enough guns for each man to hold one at the same time, but few could argue that they had taken up arms, at least in spirit. The shots would have made a spine-tingling sound as they rang out across the frozen lake. One by one, the unlucky Red soldiers fell to their knees on the ice, the stark contrast of their blood on the snow offering a final gory reminder of the Red versus White struggle. Some accounts say that 80 soldiers were executed in this way. The survivors of Spartacus had been decimated. The defeat was complete. There are some practical aspects to this punishment. The Whites wanted to send a message they were not to be messed with. Captured Reds may be put to death, cruelly and seemingly at random. By killing 1 in every 10, or by some accounts 1 in every 7, they could send out their message whilst also saving resources. The process was devastating for the Reds, killing a large number of their men and breaking the spirit of the survivors, and the Whites had achieved this without expending too much ammunition. More recently, though, many have disputed the events on the ice at Huruslahti. The men were certainly executed, but perhaps not at random. Historians believe they may have been selected according to their status as leaders and social activists. It wasn't a true decimation at all. It was just a mass execution of surrendered soldiers. This is where the rhetorical and symbolic power of decimation raises its grim head yet again. By allowing their enemy to believe a decimation had taken place, the White Finns had drawn upon the language and methodology of ancient Rome to send a message to the Reds. And by dressing up the slaughter in the trappings of a millennia-old martial punishment, they may have made it easier to pretend that mass killing was something noble and respectable, rather than what it was, a war crime.